Before the swords, before the raids, before any of the stories you think you know, there was a sound. Not the clash of steel, not the roar of the sea. A soft, patient turning. The whir of a spindle in the dark, hour after hour, night after night. An entire civilization fell asleep to that sound, and we forgot it completely. So let me ask you something that will bother you for the rest of this video. What if the Vikings were never forged in fire, but spun by hand? What if the weapon that conquered the whole North Atlantic was never sharp at all? It was soft. We put their swords behind glass. We polish their axes and light them beautifully in museum cases. But the thing that actually kept them alive rotted quietly into the ground 800 years ago. And we never even bothered to look for it. Because here is a truth that should stop you cold. There is a single Viking object that took more human labor to make than the entire warship it was attached to. One object. We'll get to it, and the number behind it will change how you hear the word raid forever. And the richest Viking grave ever opened held no king at all. It held 2 women and a loom. Hold on to that. Because everything you are about to see happened inside a window that was already closing. A gift of warmth the world was preparing to take back. Up here, remember, almost no one died on the edge of a blade. They died wet. Sea wind and salt water and damp that reached the bone. That was the real killer of the North, not the sword. So the real question isn't how the Vikings fought. It's this: who actually built their world? Not the men we remember, the hands we forgot. The answer begins, the way it so often does, with a child, and with a pair of hands that were never allowed to be still. A Viking child did not choose their life. The land chose it for them, long before they could understand why. But in this world, the first tool pressed into a small hand was not a bow, it was a spindle. Picture a mother folding her 4-year-old's fingers around that spinning weight, guiding the thread, her voice low and certain. "If your hands are still," she says, "the winter wins." And she means it exactly. Because up here, spinning was not a woman's hobby tucked away in a corner. It was the pulse of the entire society. Men spun on the deck of a ship between strokes. Children spun on the walk to the shore. The old spun through the long dark by firelight. Everyone, always, kept the thread moving. Because a body that stopped producing warmth was a body the winter had already marked. And what those hands could do borders on the unbelievable. Long before knitting even existed, the Norse used a technique called knoll binding, a dense, looping stitch worked with a single needle, so tight and so warm it was nearly waterproof. We're not guessing at this. A knoll-binding sock, pulled from the ground at York, survived more than 1,000 years, still holding its shape. Now, the sagas love to take you into the forge, the smith who listens to his steel, who runs a thumb along the edge and says, "It sings." And that world was real. But there was a second fire in every Viking home, and it never made the songs. It was the hearth where the wool was worked. Because raw fleece carries its own quiet miracle. Lanolin, the natural grease in unwashed sheep's wool, which makes the fiber shed water instead of soaking it up. A Viking in a lanolin-rich wool cloak could be soaked through and still hold his own body heat. It was a raincoat 800 years before rubber. This is why, when archaeologists opened the richest Viking grave ever found, at Oseberg, and saw the weaving tools laid carefully beside 2 women, they were not looking at decoration. They were looking at power. Because these hands didn't just make cloth.
They wove the one thin, warm thing standing between a living body and a cold that wanted it dead. But warmth alone was never enough.
You still had to eat, and up here there was only ever one true enemy waiting to see if you would. Not kingdoms, not armies. Winter. Winter was not a season in the north, it was a predator, and it hunted with patience, waiting month after month for a single mistake. So when the men went out into the snow after a stag, nothing was rushed and nothing was random. And when the animal finally went down, a rough hand pressed gently into fur that was still warm, and quiet words of thanks drifted up into the cold. To us, that sounds like superstition. It was the opposite. The meat fed them, the hide broke the wind, the bones became tools, the sinew became thread. Nothing taken without purpose, nothing thrown away. But meat rots, and the dark is long, so the real magic wasn't the hunt. It was what came after. Instead of only smoking or salting, the Norse did something stranger and older. They drowned their food in whey, the sour, fermented liquid left over from making cheese. They called it sur, and the lactic acid in it held meat and fat safe through months of darkness. That same living fermented milk gave them skyr, the thick Norse staple that is the direct ancestor of a food half the world spoons out of a cup this morning. And when the snow finally sealed the roads, sharing stopped being a kindness and became law. Food was divided by need, never by desire, because one greedy hand could starve a whole village by spring. But here is the part that will surprise you. In Iceland, the most valuable currency in the land was not silver. It was cloth. Woven woolen lengths called vadmal, made to a fixed standard, were used to pay taxes, settle debts, even pay fines. Which means the women sitting at the loom through the endless winter were not only keeping their families warm, they were quite literally printing the money of an entire nation. Now look again at those two women buried at Oseberg in the year 834, laid to rest in the richest grave ever unearthed, beside a whole ship, a wagon, and their weaving tools. In this world, whoever held the thread held the economy. And there was a smell that told you that you had won. Wool and whey, wood smoke and warm bodies packed close in the dark. A smell we will never breathe again. Hold on to it, because even a world spun this tightly can still come apart, one thread at a time. To see how tightly that world was spun, step inside the longhouse. But don't measure the walls. Feel the room. The first thing that meets you isn't stone or timber. It's wool. Long woven hangings, called refill, run the length of the walls, and they are doing two jobs at once. They are the household's art, its color and its pride, and they are a second skin of insulation trapping warmth against the cold pressing in from outside. Along the sides sit the box beds, wooden enclosures that hold a sleeper's own body heat, like cupped hands around a flame. 3 generations breathe the same smoky air in a single room, and that closeness is not poverty. It is the design. This was never just a house that held heat. It was a house lined with wool from the inside out. And the same hands that lined that house also drove the ships. We rightly marvel at the Viking ship as a masterpiece of wood, the long, single keel that let it carry a mast and truly sail instead of merely being rowed, the shallow hull that could run straight up onto a beach or slip far inland up a shallow river. It was one of the finest machines of its age. But the ship was only ever half the miracle. Because a ship needs a sail. And a Viking sail was roughly 90 square meters of hand-woven wool. A single sail that swallowed the fleece of a large flock of sheep and tens of thousands of hours of spinning, weaving, and combing. When archaeologists actually reconstructed one by hand, the conclusion was staggering. The sail took more human labor to produce than the entire ship it was raised above. Sit with that. Every raid you have ever heard of, every longship on every horizon that ever made a monastery's blood run cold, began years earlier, with women spinning quietly by firelight. No thread, no sail. No sail, no voyage. No voyage, no Vikings. And yet, at night, when the hall filled with ale and firelight caught the horn like liquid gold, the stories that rose into the smoke were of sea dragons and gods and warriors who fought until the waves themselves seemed to bleed. Someday, the elders would say, the skalds will sing of you too. And they did sing, of the sword, of the shield, of the killing. They never once sang of the thread that carried the whole thing across the ocean. The silent, spinning labor that made every legend possible simply vanished from the song. Up there, in that warm and crowded hall, they believed the wind would blow warm forever. It wouldn't. So come back, one last time, to that crowded hall at the end of the day. The feast has quieted. The fire has fallen from roaring flame to a low orange glow. And here, the Vikings become the thing the songs almost never recorded. They become parents. Good night, little one. Good night, mother. Sleep well. And a mother draws a woolen blanket up over her child, a blanket she spun and wove and finished with her own hands. That smell in the dark, wool and whey and wood smoke, and the warmth of bodies close together, that was the smell of safety. And it is the one thing archaeology will never, ever pull out of the ground. We can recover the ship. We can recover the sword. We can never recover that. But now I have to tell you why all of it ended. Because none of this happened in an ordinary world. The entire Viking age bloomed inside a rare gift of climate we now call the medieval warm period. A few unusual centuries of gentler weather that quietly opened the sea roads and made the whole adventure possible. And then the gift was withdrawn. The Little Ice Age crept in. The winds turned colder, the seas grew ice, and slowly the window that had let them out into the world swung shut. Here is the part that should stay with you. They were never truly conquering the cold. They were borrowing warmth, and the loan, like every loan, eventually came due. And this is where we betray them. We dig them up and we keep the swords, because swords survive. We lose the thread because thread rots into the soil. And so we remember exactly the wrong half of them, the killing, and never the keeping. So let me leave you with the only question that really matters tonight. In your own life, what is the sword, the loud, gleaming thing that everyone sees and praises? And what is the thread, the quiet, unglamorous work that is actually holding the whole of it together, the thing you will only notice on the day it finally breaks? The Vikings never got to answer that question. You still can. If the forgotten truths of the past can teach us how to face what's coming, then this journey is far from over. Like, share, and subscribe to Dark Origins, not just to uncover history, but to hear what it's still trying to tell us.